Good morning, students. This is Father Kilian. We're back again, and we're going to try to wrap up our study of the rule of St. Benedict today. And I hope you enjoyed Professor Ernesto Chavez's presentation on the Hindu scripture. And I think I mentioned to you at the beginning of the semester that I had 3 or 4 different guest speakers coming in, especially those who had expertise in areas beyond the Judeo-Christian areas where my own sort of knowledge lies. I also, for the study of the Rule of Benedict, I also had asked, I think, 4 or 5 of the Benedictine monks from the abbey to come to class and to dialogue with you about their particular roles. The abbot was one, and the prior, and also the procurator. But anyway, I'm glad you had a chance to hear Brother Damien Joseph, and I'm not quite sure. I don't think we can manage as I had planned originally. But I did want to tell you that the faculty had a meeting last Thursday, and it was, I think almost the entire faculty were able to gather. Of course, it was online, and it was nice to see so many faces on the screen of my colleagues. But it was interesting. We had some business that we needed to take care of. That is, we had to appoint and to vote for particular candidates for faculty positions and committee work. Also, the president of the university, Dr. Hendricks, spoke and gave a kind of State of the Union address to the faculty, all very positive and encouraging. But what I thought was really wonderful, that the bulk of the meeting really was the faculty's concern for each one of you. It was really inspiring. The faculty are taking very seriously the position that you're in, many of you, and many of them had sort of quoted anonymously, obviously, some concerns that many students have about having the proper equipment at home, managing to get the work done, and all of the problems that come in with this online teaching. So I just wanted to tell you that, because if you're feeling any way alienated or at odds with things, you're not alone. And you have the full and total support of the faculty are behind you. So don't think you're swimming upstream on your own. We're all there with you, and obviously our mission is to provide the very best possible education for you, and we'll continue to do that under these rather strained conditions. So, well, for today's class, I would like to sort of wrap up a little bit of the Rule of St. Benedict and talk about a couple of points. But I wanted to also mention to you that on Wednesday, one of the guest speakers that I had invited to come in to talk with you, that was Dr. Ian Werrett, a member of the Religious Studies Department, a very fine professor, and I talked to him about presenting the material on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a very interesting sort of topic and very relevant topic for many today. So he will be here on Wednesday for Wednesday's class. And then, as you probably know, we won't have class on Friday because that's Good Friday, and it's a school holiday, and also the following Monday, which is we call Emmaus Monday. There's no classes on Monday either. So we won't be coming back again until the following Wednesday. And at that class, I'm going to begin our study of Flannery O'Connor. And so what I'm going to ask you now in preparation is to please read the first story on our list would be The Displaced Person. So if you could read that over the Easter break and have your thoughts and your reflections ready, that would be fantastic. So I also wanted to mention to you that as we wrap up our study of the Rule of Benedict, one of the things I wanted you to be thinking about is How does the rule reflect today? In other words, what do you, having read the rule and having looked at 2 or 3 different chapters in depth to some extent, do you find the rule relevant today? Or what are some of the directives and some of the messages that we find in the rule that are relevant in your own life, in the life of all of us today? So if you could be thinking about that in preparation of a possible, when we come to the final end of the semester, that would be something I hope you could say, that the Rule of St. Benedict, even though it's 1,500 years old, it was written in an ancient time, it's still very relevant today. And why is that? That's what I want you to be thinking about. Speaking of our next reading assignment, once we've finished with the Rule of St. Benedict, is the short stories of Flannery O'Connor. And I would like to begin with the study of our first story, and that is The Displaced Person. I remember asking you at the beginning of this semester, when I was introducing the class, how many of you had read any of the stories, the short stories of Flannery O'Connor, and I think there were just very few, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of you out of the class that has actually had the experience of reading Flannery O'Connor. And I wanted to I'll just say something very briefly about this, and we'll get into it next week. But Flannery O'Connor uses the short story. And the short story is one of the most difficult and complex forms of literary expression. It's much easier to write poetry or to write 1,500-word or page, I should say, novel, even writing drama, the play, essays. But the short story is so difficult because, in fact, it is short. And so the short story writer is limited to time, place, and event. In other words, most short stories take place within a period of 24 hours. Usually it's focused on one locale, and there's just basically one event. And so the short story writer doesn't have hundreds of pages to explain or to describe a character or to reflect on generations of the past. It has to be done now. So it's a very complex, but yet a very rewarding form of literature. So one of the things that you have to be very much aware of is the character. There's types of characters. We sometimes call them round characters and flat characters. We have to also be very much conscious of the point of view from which the story is being told. You have to be very conscious of the story writer's use of symbols, metaphors. Those things are very critical because they tell us so much more, since the story writer doesn't have the space or the time to go into any sort of detailed description. So I just wanted to kind of make you at least bring that to your attention. And I suspect that probably many of you have gone through literature classes in high school and maybe other English classes, so you're well aware of these things. So just again to remind you, it's difficult to even talk about wrapping up the Rule of St. Benedict because it's so very much a part, at least of my own life and certainly the life of the Benedictine monks at the Abbey here. But sometimes I have students and others who may have read the Rule of Benedict, and they'll oftentimes say, well, there's some really strange things that go on the Rule. Do you guys still do this kind of thing, or is this still a practice in the community? And I think you have to remember that the Rule was written 1,500 years ago, and it's a very, very different day today than it was then. For example, the chapter on hospitality, or sometimes it's called the reception of guests, and if you find this in chapter 53, and it reads, "All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, For he himself will say, I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. And you will also notice that when Benedict raises these various questions of how to treat people, how one must live, he oftentimes goes back into the scripture and uses it as a sort of basis for his position or his point of view. And as it goes on, that same chapter talks about the abbot, when the guest comes, the abbot shall pour water on the hands of the guests, and the abbot with the entire community shall wash their feet. Now, that would sound very odd, I think, to most people today. But again, keeping in mind that most of the guests that went to the monastery in those ancient days probably went on foot. There were no trains or buses or airplanes, obviously. And so they would have been exhausted, and their feet would have been tired and dirty. And that would have been a very proper way of receiving the guests, of respecting them, by making things comfortable for them. And the washing of the feet would certainly be one way of doing that. Another chapter that might appear sort of strange to somebody reading the rule for the first time, it would be, for example, chapter 55, the clothing and the footwear of the brothers. Now, when strangers come to the campus here at St. Martin's and they see the monks walking around with these black robes and they say, oh, that seems really odd. Well, that would have been the normal wear, the normal clothing, the normal dress of a monk during St. Benedict's time. And as the rule says in chapter 55, the clothing distributed to the brothers should vary according to local conditions and climate, because more is needed in cold regions and less in warmer regions. So in other words, the quality of the material of the robe. And then it goes on to say, for example, when one of the brothers needs to go on a travel someplace, or the brothers going on a journey should get underclothing from the wardrobe, and on the return they are to wash it and give it back. Well, I assure you, we don't do that today. Everybody has their own underwear. And the same thing, he comes on, he says, in order that the vice of collecting things and having too much, private ownership may be completely uprooted, and the abbot is to provide all things necessary. That is, a cowl, a tunic, sandals, shoes, a belt, a knife, and a stylus. And the stylus would be a pen or a pencil of some sort, a needle, and a handkerchief, and a writing tablet. So that's all the monk would really need in terms of his daily life. When we think about that, that's not very much. But of course, that is not the case today. Our mission today is very different, perhaps, than the mission the monks had in those ancient days. When a monk has to go on a journey, obviously he has to get permission and a blessing from the abbot. And I can remember different people saying how odd they thought that was. You're being treated like sort of children, that you can't go anyplace without getting permission from the abbot to do this. Well, it isn't a matter of being treated as children. It's a matter of respect. In other words, I would have well imagined your own homes, when you leave, you obviously let your parents know where you're going and when you will be back. Will you be there for dinner or not? So there's nothing extraordinary or unusual about that. But we do that today. It's a practice that I think we all do, and it's a matter of courtesy. It's a matter of generosity. It's letting people know where you are. And so we still go today, when we leave the campus, to get a blessing. And if the abbot's not there, we go to the next brother who is next in line. Might be the prior or the sub-prior or the oldest monk in the community. And so, and that's something I know in my own family. Whenever we went any place, my father, I think it was an old Irish tradition that he always gave us a blessing before we went back to school or before we returned to college or wherever we might be going. So that's, I think, nothing unusual about that, but that's something that the rule sort of insists on, that the monk get the blessing, receive the blessing before he leaves someplace. Another interesting chapter that sometimes people will ask about, and that's chapter 33, Monks and Private Ownership. And Benedict says, and I'll just quote from page 56 of our little red book, "Above all, this evil practice must be uprooted and removed from the monastery. We mean that without an order from the abbot, no one may be permitted to give, receive, or retain anything as his own, nothing at all, not a book, not a writing tablet, not a stylus, that is a pen, in short, not a single item, especially since monks may not have the free disposal, even of their own bodies and wills. For their needs they are to look to the father of the community, and are not allowed anything which the abbot has not given permission for. All things should be in common possession of all, as it is written, so that no one presumes to call anything his own." And again, there Benedict is quoting from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4. And you wonder, well, what is the purpose behind all of this? And I guess you could say that what it does, that there is a tendency perhaps that Benedict recognized in human nature of hoarding, you sometimes see these horrendous episodes on the television of people who hoard, and they're sort of overwhelmed with all the stuff they're collecting. And you could even remember probably when this virus first broke out, people rushed to the stores and they purchased truckloads of toilet paper and truckloads of stuff that and in some ways there's something selfish about that. Living in community, not only a monastic community, but in your family, in your homes, in your amongst your friends and relatives, hoarding is a bad business because it tends to express a kind of selfishness, and that's a sort of a real violation of community. You can't live peacefully in community if someone is selfish and hoarding for his own or her own self. There are some key elements of Benedictine life as found in the rule, and so when you are sort of reflecting on what you might think is relevant still today of this ancient document, it seems to me that the very purpose of following the rule is and the very purpose of for example, a monastic vocation is aimed at seeking God, is trying to discover God in one's life. That is the purpose of that's the ideal, and everything else is designed to help the individual seek the presence of God. That's essentially how the rule works. I sometimes think people talk about the monastic family as a family. Well, it isn't really designed as a family because in a family you don't have a choice of who your mother is going to be. In a family you don't have a choice of who your father is going to be. You have no choice about who your brothers or sisters will be. That's what family life is. But in monastic life, there is that choice. It's very much a sort of a free choice of who the father or the abbot of the community will be through an election, or who the administrators or the deans or the procurator, they're basically selected. So that's one difference. But what's perhaps most important in the monastic community is the life of prayer. It isn't so much an activity that the monks do 4 or 5 times a day. It's a whole approach to life, being aware of God's presence in time and in place, being open to the mysteries of God and God's goodness and God's presence. It's about listening and about hearing. So that's what prayer is. It's not so much a matter of saying so many psalms or so many Hail Marys or prayers, whatever it might be, but it's a matter of being always in the presence of the holy, being in the presence of the sacred, that life is a sacred gift. And I think all of our lives, regardless of who we might be, should be a life of prayer. And I think also the element of silence, as I think some of you have reflected on that already. Silence is it's a recollected attentiveness to what lies at the heart of reality. Once the sort of the clutter and the noise sort of is set aside, the silence gives us an opportunity to see ourselves in our relationship with others and with God in a much clearer way. And so one of the stipulations that Benedict has is that we observed what we call the night silence or the grand silence. So after evening prayer, silence is supposed to be very much a part of monastic life, that the monks aren't partying or creating lots of noise and racket in the rooms, but rather keeping the sacredness of silence. And the same thing with our meals. So I've oftentimes invited students to come to have a meal with us, and we eat our meals for the most part in silence. And I've oftentimes thought, well, that's probably strange, because people usually when they're sitting down to eat, they chat with each other. But the purpose of the silence is to be able to listen to the reader. And we usually read something that is inspiring. And so as we're listening to the reader, and we're also, I think, much more conscious of those at the table with us. And I think we can oftentimes respond more readily if somebody needs something or if something needs to be passed to somebody else. I think we're much more conscious and aware as we're reflecting on the reading and as the silence provides us to be much more attentive to one another. Another sort of element of Benedictine life is community life itself, pursuing personal holiness as members of a community committed to monastic life with like-minded individuals, finding guidance in our relationship with one another, finding advice, correction, fraternal love, and companionship. So there's something really wonderful about community life. And I think that in reading the rule, Benedict points out how important community life is. And again, it works for monks, and it should also work as well for people who are not monks, people who live in communities, whether it's in your work environment, whether it's in your home, whether it's with your family or community or neighbors. The same sense of community, respect for one another should also be very much in evidence. Another one of the key elements of Benedictine life is the spirit of poverty, and it's not a matter of going hungry or wearing raggy clothes or having holes on our shoes. That's not what poverty is about. It's poverty is about the desire not to accumulate stuff, not to be overwhelmed with things, but rather to be able to be comfortable in what you need, and what is beyond what you need is to be able to share that with others, and to be able to be generous in looking. That's why community life helps us to see one another more clearly and what others might need. And sometimes it means not only sharing what we have with others in terms of our worldly goods, whatever that might be, but also our time and our patience and our understanding and our compassion for one another. That's what, in a sense, community life is about. And there's also another element known that we call conversion. that daily we are converting our lives and regenerating our lives and becoming much more deeply human than we were, say, the day before or the week before. So it was a constant sort of, I think you might have seen some of those, the ladders going up, the steps leading to holiness. And you'll notice this also in Flannery O'Connor. She was very much taken by Teilhard Chardin, the philosopher, the 19th century philosopher. She was very much taken with his works. But Desjardins says that we advance in holiness continuously as we improve in our kindness to others and our generosity to others. We rise, and then eventually a life that is led in that, to that extent, we converge with the divine. That's that sense of whatever rises must converge. That's actually one of the titles of one of our books, short stories that we'll be reading. Another, there's several other sort of key elements that are very much a part of monastic life, or, as the rule points out, the question of stability, the question of work, the importance of work, the question of obedience, which I think some of you had already touched on. And what's interesting about obedience is that to some extent, I remember before I came to the monastery, I used to think, the various vows that I would be taking are the ones that would be the most difficult. And the ones that, the one I thought would be the easiest would be the one on obedience. But I found that to be in some ways one of the most difficult, because what one is doing is you're laying aside your own will in order to be free to do that of God, as God is expressing God's will within community. Community obedience is actually freedom from the enslavement of self-will and sin. And if you think about that for a moment, a good parent, if you remember when you're very young, your parents probably sacrificed so much for you. And that in some ways is what obedience is about. It's about the willingness to give up any tendencies towards self-satisfaction or self-gratification in order to be more available to others. That's like your parents would be. Hopefully you all had good parents that were sacrificing their time and and out of generosity for their child. And in some ways that's how I kind of look at obedience in that sense, is that it's a matter of being willing to set aside my own wants and desires so I could be available for others. As we're talking about the key elements of Benedictine life, what occurred to me was the element of stability. And that oftentimes raises a lot of questions for people who are not monks or people who are not familiar with monastic life. But Brother Damien Joseph happens to be sitting here next to me. And so I was going to just ask you, Brother Damien, before you came to St. Martin's Abbey, what did you think about the possibility that you were going to have to sort of take a vow of stability? What did that mean to you?
Well, I don't think I understood it quite the same way then that I understand it now. I was a little bit anxious about the thought, does that mean I'll never be able to go outside again? Does that mean that I won't be able to go and visit and see my friends who live, they live about 3 hours away up in Bellingham, most of my friends. I've got also friends in Seattle, and my family lives about an hour or two south of here. And I was worried, will I ever see them again, or will I just be stuck on this land? And actually, what I found was that I do have, with the blessing of the abbot, I do have the ability to still be in contact with and see my friends. And it's not much different than, in my experience anyway, than a married person who is committed to his wife and his family. He doesn't get out very much either. It's not like being in college where you got to see your friends every single day, except for now because of this horrible coronavirus. But under normal circumstances, it's not like seeing your friends every day. And that's something that I realized I needed to grow out of anyways as a person entering his late 20s and early 30s. Most of my friends were having families, and they just weren't available to hang out all the time anyway. And so I found within stability, within being committed to this land, that I could kind of order my life towards a mission or towards a particular purpose, and that it wasn't. It's like obedience. It's ordering your will towards the will of the community or the will of the abbot. So I'm giving myself up for something greater than myself, something better than I could accomplish on my own. And that's kind of also what stability does. It frees us up, I think.
Yeah, no, sure, no, that's great. Yeah, so oftentimes people will talk about, say, for example, other religious communities, like, say, the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Jesuits, and they seem to get shifted around from one place to the next. And I remember somebody asked me, don't you wish that you could go to different places or different houses? And I would, at first, I thought the same. I feel much the same. Before I came, I realized that I was going to be sort of, as it were, stuck here in the community and on the St. Martin's property, and I'd never be able to go any place again. That's certainly not the case. Stability is about having roots and having a place that we call home, and even though many of us have to go away to be educated to other universities or so we can continue with our mission here. And I think if we did not have the vow of stability, if we were not here permanently, it would be very, very difficult to continue the mission that we have here at St. Martin. That is the education of our students that come to us. And what's so kind of amazing is even though I've been here since 1952, I have former students coming back, and the first thing they say, "Oh, you're still here," and I think that's something that they find amazing, because I think we live in a very unstable and a very shifting populace today in today's world. But at the same time, I also want to take note of the various homecomings we have and the gatherings we have. Students that are coming back who were here in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they find it really wonderful that they can get back here, because their time here at St. Martin's was a life-changing experience for them. Yeah. And they carry that with them, and so they always feel connected because something special happened from their professors, from their fellow students, from their experience of the life and the spirit of St. Martin's that stayed with them. And so in some ways, they're stable because the St. Martin's experience was really important for them.
Yeah, that's true. Our stability does extend in a kind of spiritual or ethereal way. It does kind of extend to those around us, because if I think about my alma mater, I went to Western Washington University and graduated 10 years ago, and if I went back there today, there might only be a couple professors who are still there, who didn't move to a different college, and none of my classmates would be there, and none of my other mentors would be there. It'd be, the buildings would be the same, but it would be a slightly different university. It wouldn't be like going home. But a lot of people, when they come here, they do feel like they're coming home, even if they've graduated 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. Father Gerard of blessed memory would often recount, when I was studying under Father George, that Father Gerard too studied under Father George. However many years ago, that would have been 50 years ago or more, 60 years ago, and how just about anybody, no matter their age, when they come here, they say, "Oh, I remember studying under Father George. Is he still teaching?" And they're blown away to find out that he's still teaching. And that's another aspect of stability is that this place becomes a home for so many people.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's, and it is, in addition to the individuals, is also this Benedictine spirit that they know that if they come back, they will be warmly welcomed. And I'm not sure if that's the same. I remember I studied for some time in London at the Jesuit school at Heathrow in London, and it was years later that I went back, and I was so excited to go back. And first of all, I couldn't get in because I didn't have a pass, and they were very cold about it. And I tried to explain, well, I was a student here at one time, but there was nobody there that recognized who I might have been.
I hate that.
And so there was kind of a disappointment. And I hope that our own students will always feel that that they can come back here, that this is a basis of stability for them, that there will always be a place at St. Martin's, and no matter how difficult getting through classes or managing your finances or your student loans, that St. Martin's would always try to do the best to provide the very best kind of education for our students. And okay, I think that thank you very much, Brother Damien Joseph, for your insights on that, on stability. That was interesting. I just wanted to remind the rest of you that on Wednesday we'll have our guest speaker come, Dr. Ian Werrett, and he will. I think you'll find it very interesting. So please tune in for that. And then when we come back after the Easter break, the following Wednesday, we'll begin our study of Flannery O'Connor. So please read carefully, and read it a couple of times, The Displaced Person, and keep an eye on the character and the various symbols and images that seem to you to appear as you're reading the story. And take some notes to yourself, and so we can have a discussion about the displaced person. And I would ask you, just as you're reading through, who in the story is the displaced person? Anyway, well, take care. Bye-bye.